Let's look at a few more details of how the grids and the resolutions work and what we mean by them. So here is a full representation. I just said we have equations, we cannot solve them, we discretize them, we solve them on the computer and so on. These are techniques called numerical methods. If you don't know what they are, then don't worry about it. It's just a way of solving very complicated equations which cannot be solved analytically, as I said before. Let's leave it there. We'll look at a few more details when we go to a full section on climate models. So here we are looking at the discretized or grid-wise representation of Earth with its lithosphere, soil, vegetation, mountains, ice sheets, and so on. Not every model represents the lithosphere in its processes, but we have to represent the Earth because ocean, for example, has coastal ocean, shelf ocean, deeper ocean, and so on, and it has sea ice, and it talks to the atmosphere, and it absorbs and emits radiation, as we saw. There is exchange of energy and water and so on between the land and the atmosphere. Atmosphere itself has got a bunch of grids, so it's horizontal and vertical exchanges of momentum, energy, heat, heat and energy, chemicals, water vapor, and so on. Atmosphere-ocean interactions. So we had seen that as this Earth system process before, where the processes that we are trying to represent are the solar energy coming in, long wave energy going out, atmosphere ice interactions, heat exchanges, ice ocean interactions and coupling, changes in the ocean circulation by geochemistry, land atmosphere interactions, winds forcing the ocean, precipitation and evaporation, cloud formations, atmospheric circulation, composition, including all the chemistry, terrestrial radiation, human influences, and so on and so forth. Okay, so those are all the processes that are being done at each grid point, and then some fluxes have to be exchanged between neighboring grid points. So this grid point will have certain temperature, water vapor, winds, chemistry, and it exchanges in every direction, behind, up, down, sideways, and so on and so forth. And at the surface it'll exchange either with land or the ocean. Okay, just think of it that way. And here is another way to look at it. So we take one grid point, we have the ocean, so there is heat transfer from the ocean to the atmosphere. Wind is forcing the ocean, so momentum is going into the ocean and producing currents. Water vapor evaporation is exchanging water vapor from the ocean into the atmosphere, and within the grid box of the atmosphere we are carrying carbon dioxide, dust, water, so you can see that there is exchange in and out at every direction. So these equations basically keep track of what's going out, what's coming in terms of each variable: momentum, energy, chemistry, dust, water, and so on. So of course we have to do energy balance as well, emitted and reflected radiation, incoming solar radiation, and momentum of the winds, and so on. So it's good to just look at a few versions of these just to get a sense of what we mean. What do we mean by resolution? So since we are representing the Earth with a number of grid points, larger the number of grid points, the better the representation. For example, here we are jumping from the land to ocean. The corner here is a very sharp edge, but if we increase the number of these grid points, then the smooth curves get represented much better, and that's what is being shown here. So illustrations of land surface, green and brown colors, and sea floor in blue at fine, so 10 kilometer resolution here, and coarse or 100 kilometer resolution here. It means in this case each grid is 10 kilometers on side in the horizontal, and here it's 100 kilometers on the side. So That means in this coarser grid, you are representing various processes like temperatures, winds, etc., averaged over 100-kilometer box, whereas in the other one you are representing it as a 10-kilometer average over that box. But the representation of the land and vegetation, you can see this has got much sharper features. Of course, it's still not enough at all, because if you are walking around here in Baja California or parts of California mountains and so on, you know that the resolution is almost continuous. But for computer representation, we cannot have infinite number of boxes. Why? Because calculations between exchanges between each box will increase tremendously as you increase the number of boxes. So better resolution is important for better representation of the processes of exchange of momentum, energy, water vapor, CO2, dust, and so on and so forth, and for formation of clouds, precipitation, temperature calculations, and so on. But computers have a limitation about how much resolution we can provide, because the number of calculations increase exponentially as you increase the grid boxes by this kind of range from 100 kilometers to 10 kilometers. Okay, so here note that elevations and depths are strongly exaggerated with respect to horizontal distances. So obviously US is a massive continent, and these are highly exaggerated with respect to the horizontal scales, just to show that as you increase resolution, the representation of the land and ocean, etc., become much better. So you can see the shelf area and the channels in the ocean much better represented here than here. So this is another way to look at it. In the 1990s, when the computers were not as powerful and the processes and data were not as extensive as at present, there were typically 192 boxes in the east-west direction. So the sphere was split into 192 longitudinal grids, and in the latitudinal direction there were 80 in the north to south direction. Number of grids 80 in the meridional direction, 192 in the east-west direction. By 2009, which is already a little bit behind, there were typically 1440 boxes east to west. This is in the geophysical fluid dynamics lab in Princeton of a NOAA lab, and they had 1070 grid boxes. So you can see the representation here looks much more realistic than here, these choppy coastline compared to these. It is still not enough, obviously, and the newer models now in 2021 have many more boxes than these. And also there is the similar calculation in the vertical, in the atmosphere and in the ocean, because exchanges also happen in the vertical, and those numbers are also increasing because the waves that are running around, the winds that are to be resolved, the humidity that has to be calculated, energy that has to be moved around, everything is done better when you have better representation of the horizontal and vertical processes. Other thing I mentioned in the title of this podcast is parameterization. We looked at some equations and said we solved them on the computer, but there are many processes for which we don't have explicit equations. Cloud processes are one of those. So here is cloud processing of aerosols. So you can see there are processes like impaction, nucleation scavenging, aqueous sulfate production, Brownian diffusion, coalescence, collection, evaporation, of course, salt crystal shattering, particle nucleation, crystal collection, riming, and so on and so forth. These are all known from observations and lab experiments and fundamental understanding. But when you are doing a global calculation like this, and the scales go from molecular scale of water vapor interactions with dust and cloud condensation nuclei to form clouds, to planetary scale winds and energy and rainfall and so on. You cannot represent this full range of scales. those scales are often argued to be larger than the orders of magnitude of processes across the universe. So in that case, we make some simplifications of these processes, and they are not explicitly represented using data and other approaches, statistical, empirical approaches. All these processes are simplified into some calculations so that the winds, water vapor, temperature, humidity can be used together to approximate these processes, and those are called parameterizations. So the exact details of microphysics that go into formation of clouds are not always well known. Nowadays there are more explicit cloud resolving models, but they need incredible amount of computing power to do processes at those small scales and then produce global features and global circulations and global interactions and so on. So parameterizations are very ubiquitous in all the components on land, in the ocean, in the atmosphere, in the clouds, in the vegetation. For example, the mixing in the ocean or mixing in the atmosphere doesn't happen at molecular scale. That's not so important, but there is these so-called eddies or processes by which mixing happens in the ocean and in the atmosphere that are represented by parameterizations in terms of the gradients of various quantities that are being mixed, like the temperature or humidity in the ocean, temperature, salinity, or nutrients, or whatever else you have. Okay, so those are parameterizations. So parameterizations are representations of processes that are not explicitly understood, or often not explicitly able to be represented for computational purposes and so on. But there is ways in which parameters are tuned or calibrated or made better with more data and so on and so forth, which are details we won't get into in this introductory course. Okay.